I'm going to start today by saying something very politically incorrect that I can get away with because I have tenure, and you probably shouldn't repeat. Ukrainians are morbid. They see everything from the wrong side. Everything is terrible. Everything is sorrowful. Everything is, as bad as it could possibly be. Let me give you two quick examples. If I told you that the Ode to Joy was a Ukrainian art song, you'd immediately know that's a lie, right? No Ukrainian poet ever wrote an Ode to Joy, right? More or less, right? And the music doesn't sound Ukrainian either. I'll give you another example. Christmas carols, right? Christmas carols are the joyful music of Christianity. Nothing can be happier than the newborn Savior of mankind. There's a beautiful Ukrainian carol, Nova Radість стала, a new joy has come. The words themselves, right? A new joy has come. I shouldn't sing in this audience. Nova Radість стала. It's a dirge. Right. The joyful Christmas carol is immediately turned into funeral music, right? Right. That's how Ukrainians do things, right? And it's true of a good deal of the poetry we're looking at today. I mean, you know this poetry, you've been singing it, you've been reading it over, and I had the audacity to put more of this mournful stuff in your hands, right? A lot of it is sorrowful. Even when we try to smile a little bit, it's actually sad, right? And so that's one of the reasons that I want to start today with what I didn't do last time, Полотичина. The other reason is, of course, a great deal of art song music, Ukrainian or otherwise, is not really great poetry. Right? That is, why does a composer choose a particular poem to compose to is something I don't know the answer to. That is, as I told you last time, I don't know much music, I don't study composers, so I don't know how they actually make these choices. A lot of it is the spirit of the times. And so in Ukrainian literature, a lot of sorrowful music, and a lot of not so great poetry. I mean, the sorrowful part at least makes sense historically. I told you last time, that is, in the history of Ukrainian culture, the whole 19th century, there's not a lot of things to be really joyful about. And in the 20th century, it doesn't really get any better, right? So you can at least understand from a political point of view, from a social point of view. I mean, if you're enserfed, you're not going to sing joyful songs about serfdom, right? But the fact that composers choose poetry that is a little bit below par, that is, there is much better poetry. And that's the other reason I want to turn to Tychina. And I want to play I think in this audience, I can count on one thing that I can't always count on with every audience. You heard this probably better than other people, maybe because many of you don't know the language. This is a poem about sound. It's vowel repetitions. The sound of this, the internal rhymes in this poem, are what make it very adaptable to music. But it's also brilliant poetry. Let me just give you, from the Ukrainian text here, когось все жду, співаючи, співаючи, кохаючи, під тихий шепіт трав голублячий. This is almost untranslatable. I wait for someone while singing and loving, accompanied by the caressing whisper of the grass. That is, how many metaphors are you going to mix into this one thing? The other verse is even better. Ген неба край, як золото, мов золото поколото, горить, тремтить ріка, як музика. The edge of the sky is like gold broken into shards. The river burns and trembles like music. And music for Tychyna is very important. He was the son of a village cantor, and the cantor had no money, his father. So the only education he could get was at a monastery. And he had a good singing voice, Tychyna did. And so he went into the monastery choir, and that gave him an education, because he was singing in the choir and got an education. Came out of that, went into a seminary, close. Right? and did more music there. So Tychyna was well versed in music. That is, he had, I don't know if he had a sophisticated musical education, but certainly music was part of his life. He liked it, he understood it. But for Tychyna, music was something more than just a pattern, a way of organizing sound. For Tychyna, music was the organizing principle of the universe. That is, he's a very philosophical poet. That is, these simple little, they're not simple, but they feel simple, these metaphors. But his principle is, where does joy come from? From music, from the harmony of the cosmos, right? His entire worldview is built on the world works in harmony the way music does. That's a problematical idea with Tychyna, and Tychyna is a very problematical figure because this early Tychyna, the Tychyna of the piece we just heard, later turns into something else. But Tychyna, early Tychyna, he turns into a Stalinist ode writer. That is, in 1934, he publishes a collection of poetry, The Party Leads, and it contains some of the most scurrilous lines in literature. Всіх панів до одної ями, буржуїв за буржуями будем бить. Right? That is, we'll take all the landlords, the pane, the rich, and throw them into a hole and we'll beat them and beat them. Right? It's a good little doggerel verse, but the sentiment is horrible. In any case, so Tychyna, the later Tychyna had a long political career and went on to be many things in the Soviet Ukraine. But he's joyful, as opposed to some of the other things we were looking at. I mean, just to finish that thought about music, one of the collections of poetry he published in his early years is entitled Sunny Clarinets, right? The joy of music. A lot of what we are looking at today, and you've got it and I've got it right in front of you, is poetry of a peculiar kind. I'll start with the things that aren't Ukrainian literature. That is Heinrich Heine. I'm not a big fan of Heinrich Heine, right? Empress Elizabeth was, and from what I understand from cultural history, one of the reasons Heine is so popular is because Sisi really liked Heine, right? And she's the Austrian empress, and so, I mean, he's dead by then, but in any case, she pushed him, his reputation. So we've got these translations into Ukrainian of Heine poems, right? When two part from each other, right? It's a love song, but Heine could have been Ukrainian, right? That is, everything's always going wrong for Heine. That is, it's parting, it's not the joy of love, it's the sorrow of parting, right? And so the Ukrainian text, maybe less adeptly than Heine himself, but does essentially the same thing. The second one, what can I point out that is other than poems are strange for a German poet. For a Ukrainian poet, they're not necessarily strange. There are poems in Crimea, and poems along the southern coast. This poem couldn't be Ukrainian. But let's go on to the third Heine piece, where there is something of a little bit of interest, and that's the translator. And it's hardly a translation. That is, the Ukrainian text, "У мене був коханий рідний край." I had a beautiful native land. This is being written by Archanghel Krymsky. In the Ukrainian text, there's something important missing that's very prominent in the German original, right? Das küsste mich auf Deutsch und sprach auf Deutsch. Auf Deutsch, well, Heine. But that's the text. That's the text of Heine's poem. That is, he kissed me and spoke to me in German. Well, obviously, if you translate this into another language, you either keep that or leave it as something else, right? Krymsky translates this without using German, right? Я мову чув там рідною свою, і хтось мені щирісінько сказав по-нашому люблю, татовісні. I heard someone speak in the native language, and someone said to me, по-нашому, in our language, I love you. Well, it's not German. Right? So the poet has done something very simple. He's transposed it. But notice he doesn't use Ukrainian either. Now, Ukrainian as a word occurs in few poems in Ukrainian because Ukrainsky, 4 syllables in most romantic poetry just isn't going to work. So you don't do it, right? But in Krymsky's case, there's more. And that's because Krymsky is a unique individual. Archanghel Krymsky is the adjectival form of Crimea. So he's Archanghel of Crimea, right? He didn't actually come from Crimea, but his father was of Tatar extraction. And Krymsky lived in a world where he was Ukrainian, he was Tatar, a little bit of other things as well. And one more thing, he was gay, right? And so for someone to take this poem and turn this language, right, Я мову чув там рідною свою, і хтось мені щирісінько сказав по-нашому люблю. When you start putting all that together, someone said to me, по-нашому, and it's not even in our language, it's in our way, which in Ukrainian is a way of saying in our language, but it's not specific. For me, this is a deeply personal translation of a poem that, for Heine, doesn't have any of these meanings. Krimsky was a man who lived his entire life on the edge, in many ways, not only because he was gay, but being gay at that time was very problematical, right? And Krimsky was a man who lived well into the Soviet period. That is, he ran an institute. He was a professional scholar. That is, he was the founder of Ukrainian Orientalism at the Academy of Science. And, he was always being blackmailed because, his lover would get arrested. And this was a way of just exerting pressure on Krimsky, who was a firm Ukrainian patriot, right? And the Soviets didn't always like him. Okay. There are very few good pictures of Krimsky, but a former graduate student of mine has worked on Krimsky extensively, and he found these pictures, and Krimsky looks good here. Yeah. He usually looks fairly stupid. Let's turn to the next poem. The eagle flew down in the versions that are part of, this is the Turkevich album. And I hate to complain about translators. Uliana and I do a lot of translating. It's hard. You make dozens and dozens of mistakes. And it's really nasty when another translator says, well, you get that wrong, right? She got it wrong. That is, if you read the poem, it's very obvious that the eagle did not fly down. The eagle flew up. It took off. It took flight. And the words letiu, things can take flight and fall on the floor, or things can take flight and rise in the air, right? What's interesting here, and Markian Shishkevich, first of all, let me say a word about him. He was part of a triad of Western Ukrainian poets who introduced Romanticism in Western Ukraine. Romanticism in central Ukraine, that is in the Russian territories, is flourishing in the early 19th century. But in the Galician part, things are not good there. And they're not good not because of repressions, it's just you have a largely illiterate population. The part of the population that is literate does not particularly turn to the language of their people. Shishkevich is a cleric. He studies, that is part of the difference between Austria and Russia, is that the Austrian emperor funded, he made sure it got created, a Ukrainian Uniate seminary to train priests in Vienna, right? Which was good because it meant that you were going to have a whole class of educated clergy, including people like Shishkevich, right? And so Shishkevich starts writing with his friends, and their names are on the screen there. They produce something called the Rusalka Dnistrova, that is the river nymph of the Dniester River. Dniester River is in western Ukraine. And it's the first collection of Ukrainian romantic poetry in the West. It includes original works, it includes folklore, but he also wrote some other things, and this is one of those other things. What is curious here is the eagle took flight on his billowing wings to heaven's dwellings. That is, this is a religious poem. Essentially, this is a poem about, God enlightening us in the cosmos. That is, we see the world. His spirit reached beyond all depths to depths beyond understanding. Right? But it's a curious way of going about this. First of all, the imagery, Shushkevich is from the Carpathian Mountains. He knows what an eagle is. Eagles, that is, in our modern world, eagles aren't Christianity, eagles are Nietzsche. That is, we turn these symbols around. Now, Shushkevich is well before Nietzsche. That is, he couldn't possibly be tapping into that. But if you read the poem carefully in its symbols, these are not the usual Christian symbols. And it's unique that way, it's interesting. I'm not sure it's a very good poem, but it is certainly unique. I want to turn and devote a lot more attention to the big poet in today's class, Taras Shevchenko. I said last time that Shevchenko is the end-all and be-all of Ukrainian literature in the 19th century. This really is a brilliant poet, a poet whose ability to put words together is unmatched. He also writes in such a way that translations always do him injustice. That is, I teach Shevchenko and I refuse to teach him in English. That is, I have never taught the Shevchenko course in translation because the translations are just horrible and I refuse to do it. You won't get it. Right? But here, we can at least point out a couple of idiosyncrasies. First of all, let me give you a few facts from his biography. Shevchenko was a serf, I told you. He got manumitted, admitted to the Academy of Arts. He studied art, finished the Petersburg Art Academy. And it's not a bad gig. That is, if you are an academy-educated painter, hobnobbing with rich people, you'd be amazed how in the 19th century all rich people wanted portraits of their wives and children. Everybody, right? And Shevchenko is a good painter and a good poet, and he's becoming a fairly well-known Ukrainian figure, although the bulk of his poetry can't be published. But nevertheless, he has published one volume of poetry where all the political poetry is excluded. And so he's become known, and he's hobnobbing with the rich and famous and painting. But he's also involved in an intellectual circle that is, the Brotherhood of St. Cyril and Methodius was a very naive, quasi-religious society, kind of do-gooders, hoping to someday do good for the peasants who are enserfed. They had no political objectives. They had no political opportunities. That is, these were people, most of them were Kyiv University people. Shevchenko and a few others weren't. And they would get together and gab fest about how the world could be. That was enough to get them arrested, right? And Shevchenko in 1847 gets arrested. And the problem with Taras Shevchenko is that some of these other people are people born into status from the start, right? Some of them are, well, not aristocrats, but they're well off. Shevchenko is a former serf, and the money that bought his freedom actually came from a lottery held in the Kremlin, in the Tsar's family. So, their point of view is kind of, we paid for your freedom, and what are you doing with it now, getting yourself arrested? But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem is they found his poetry on his person. Not the poetry that had been published, the poetry that hadn't been published. And the poetry that hadn't been published is vicious. That is, that's the real Shevchenko attacking the social system, including poems that call the Tsar all kinds of names and call his wife even worse names, right? Well, the Tsar didn't like that, right? And so Shevchenko will get punished, and he will be sent into military conscription. You have a good army if you punish people by putting them in the army. Great idea. In any case, while his affair is still being settled, he is imprisoned in the building on the screen in a prison cell of, it's called the third section. It was kind of the secret police of the Russian Empire. The poem itself is a fairly traditional, in its imagery, view of death, right? The Grim Reaper is coming and cutting down everyone. Not just everyone, that is, that is, не поко се кладе горе, стогне земля, стогне море, стогне та гуде. Not mere swaths of bodies, right, but mountains of bodies. And the Ukrainian is better. In English, we've lost the sense of swath. Swath, I don't know how many of you have ever taken a scythe in your hands and gone out in the field, but what you produce is a swath of mown hay or grain or whatever. That's the technical term for it, right? In Ukrainian, that is in English, that word has lost that meaning, and everything's a swath now, right? A ribbon can be a swath of cloth, right? In Ukrainian, pokose are only grain, right? And so the image works much better in Ukrainian. But then Shevchenko gets to Nemenai Tsarya, right? He is making sure that he kind of gets his venom out. That is, it will get the Tsar too. The Grim Reaper will come for them too. And in a strange way, he puts himself in juxtaposition to the Tsar. He does not even miss a Tsar. Me too he will not miss. He'll mow me down in a far foreign land. Behind barred windows he will strangle me. No one will plant a cross above my grave, and no one will remember me. This is Shevchenko at his most typical self. That is, Shevchenko will necessarily create an image of himself, in this case, one that more or less corresponds to reality. He is in prison. Life is not great at the moment, right? But he makes himself the embodiment of social injustice. And notice, it's not just that death will come for me as well, because death comes for the Tsar, death comes for everyone. So obviously the injustice is not in death coming. The injustice is that he will come for me behind barred windows, I will not be free, and in a foreign land. That is a sentiment Shevchenko repeats over and over again throughout his poetry. That is, that I am not at home, I am in a foreign, and he did spend the majority of his adult life outside of Ukraine. At various times he wasn't even allowed into Ukraine. So here we've got a poem about death, in a sense, but the circumstances of his creation, the fact that he's sitting in the third section, prison, gives us a little more insight. From there, Shevchenko goes on, gets sent out to a fort called Orenburg, where he serves. And from Orenburg, Shevchenko actually gets released in some way. Shevchenko has been sent into the army as a military conscript. It's not fun, that is, it's drill, 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 abuse from your superiors, and so on and so on and so on. Right? And for a man like Shevchenko, an educated man, a man who by now is a man of considerable culture, that's not a lot of fun. Of course, it's not the same thing as being beaten over the head day in and day out. That is, Shevchenko complains about it as if it were torture. The other conscripts also endure everything, and they don't consider it torture, they just don't like it. Shevchenko complains a lot about it. Shevchenko gets released from that because of his painting skill. An expedition is launched to explore the Aral Sea. Now, the Aral Sea is that's a picture of the Aral Sea in 1848. That is, let me tell you, not to look for it on a map today, because the two pictures on the left and right, that's what's left of the Aral Sea today. Shevchenko would be much happier there today than he was back then. Shevchenko hated to sail. That is, being on a boat was a terror to him, right? So today it'd be okay because you walk across it, but back then you had to sail across it. In any case, Shevchenko gets sent on this expedition. It's a scientific exploratory expedition. It's actually fascinating. They built a ship in, I think it's Moscow, then took it apart, transported it out. The Aral Sea is on the border of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. It's all the way out there, right? And they transported this ship out there on horseback or mule or whatever. They grabbed Shevchenko and Orenburg because we need someone who can draw, because there are no Polaroid cameras. So, for God's sake, he's finished the Academy of Arts. And, let's go. He's coming with us. They didn't ask all the permission they needed, but who cares? This is Russia, right? They just went. And Shevchenko spent 2 years on the Aral Sea, and the winter, they wintered on an island in the Aral Sea called Kosaral. And that's where he wrote this poem. That mighty valley I shall not forget, that evening hour, the high mound where we met, and what we dreamed and spoken by us. What does it matter? For we left again, parted like strangers into different spheres, and in the meantime, all the precious years when we were young were vainly passed on by. He's sitting in this really strange place where, Europeans have not been here before, right? Other people have. The Uzbeks and the Kazakhs know all about this place, but nobody asks them, right? He's out there. He hates it, actually. I told you, he hates sailing, and for him, this is an abuse, right? But what does he remember? He remembers some kind of idyllic moment from the past. Some childhood girlfriend. Now, none of this can be verified. We know enormous amounts of facts about Shevchenko. And there's always this girl, Oksana, that everybody talks about. But Oksana was married by this time, right? That's the fact we know. So he's not thinking about her. He's making somebody up, right? But that is what informs this poem is a poet out effectively on Mars, somewhere that, there's no civilization left out here, thinking about the past. Thinking about this wonderful episode from the past, that remembering those years of true existence, right? Once again, it's a typical Shevchenko sentiment. Everything is bad. There's some illusion of the good in the past. Let me turn to the last of the Shevchenko poems. This one on Klebanov's music. This particular poem is actually based on a folk song. I won't read you the folk song. It sounds in the first section quite similar. Shevchenko has been released from his military conscription. It's 1860. He's in St. Petersburg. And he is thinking of, as he often does, his place in the world and his home country. And he's always thinking about, how wonderful it is in Ukraine, how terrible it is here. He's also Shevchenko was born in 1814. That is, he's 46. Right? He is not an old man, not by any means. That is, if you study Shevchenko, you'll discover that in 59 and 60, he painted himself any number of times. He's a painter, right? Creates autoportraits. And he looks like he's 90. You know, he's got this beard like a Jewish rabbi, right? He's got this stupid hat on him, right? He thinks of himself as a dying old man. He isn't even sickly. That is, he'll die a year later for a variety of reasons, but he's not particularly a sickly man. He's just morbid. Right? He is always complaining about something. Shevchenko loves to complain. And these images of the Cossack and the tree, the fir tree, washed by the water's waves, the way the Cossack is washed away by time. That is, it's actually very traditional death imagery from Ukrainian folk songs. But what makes this remarkable is this notion of him as an old man and looking for some kind of joy. And what informs this poem, if you look at the chronology of his poetry, I think it's 2 or 3 poems after this one, he writes a poem to Likera Polusmak, dedicated to Likera Polusmak. He wants to marry Likera Polusmak. But Likera Polusmak is a curious person for Shevchenko to marry. Likera Polusmak is a Ukrainian woman, a former serf who has also been manumitted. And she's working as a servant in some rich person's house. And Shevchenko met her, the way he met most people of her kind, that is by visiting some rich friends, and here are the servants. And Shevchenko, of course, associates with the servants. He still feels like that's my world. Right? And so he got to know this woman, proposed to her, was planning. That is, this poem is written about the time he met her. And what he is thinking of in this poem is me, aging Taras, he's not aging, but he thinks of himself that way, will find some kind of restful home. That is, there may be some joy in my life eventually with this woman I found. Now, he doesn't name her here. He will literally dedicate a poem to her a few weeks later. It's one of those ironies of Shevchenko's writing. Let me go on. I'm going to give short shrift to a number of these poets. That is, we've got Boris Hrinchenko in 2 poems. I skip one. A Dream and A Night on the Burial Mound. Hrinchenko isn't much of a poet. Hrinchenko is an activist. Hrinchenko was an important activist. That is, this is a man who accomplished a great deal in his life, and his incessant work on behalf of, one of his particular causes was education for the former serfs. That is, we're talking about the late 19th century, by which serfdom has been eliminated, but the former serfs have no rights, have no property, and in fact, they have to pay for their freedom. One of the things I want to point out here, because a lot of this is standard, these are tropes that every Ukrainian poet picks out of folklore, literally. The burial mound, the mohile, right? A mohila is a burial mound that is piled high. In the southern plains in Ukraine, on the steppes, you have thousands of these. They're old Scythian burial mounds. they've been robbed. Don't go looking for gold there. People have done this for centuries and there's no gold left. But the countryside is littered with mounds. And since the land is actually fairly flat, these mounds attract a great deal of interest. How the hell did that get there, right? And so they're a prominent feature, and you tie that to the steppe. And these two images of the burial mounds and the steppe are very, very common in all of Ukrainian poetry. That is, they become associated with some kind of nativist idea of what our country is like. It's false. That is, those are the least settled parts of the country. That is, Ukraine certainly begins somewhere else. It begins in the areas where forest mixes with open plains, not in the plains. Historically, the plains were Mongols. That is, this was a dangerous place to be. But in modern Ukrainian imagery, that's what's taken over. That is, we've got the steppes and the burial mounds as kind of markers. That is, you just throw these in as I'm Ukrainian, steppes and burial mounds. Cherkasenko is a good case in point. That is, Cherkasenko is not a major poet in any sense. He is a big Ukrainian patriot. He worked the UNR, that is the Ukrainian national government, in 1917, is a short-lived affair, and the Bolsheviks eventually overturn it, and things go sour, and Cherkasenko was an activist. His poem, notice once again, that is, hopes are not in vain. What a wonderful sentiment. That is, our hopes are not completely in vain. Something will eventually go right. That's why the Ode to Joy is not Ukrainian. And we're getting to the best example of that in a moment. I'll just stop for a moment here on Vasily Petrovsky's poem. I couldn't actually find this in the collected works of Petrovsky, and I'm wondering, how it comes about. The notation for it in the Art Song catalog talks about it quite literally as a Christian text, right? And so it may be that he has just reworked this text, but one way or another, it is not a typical Ukrainian poem. That is, it's called an Easter psalm. Christ is entering his suffering. He calls his faithful to him. Not sure why that ended up in the repertoire. And so let me tell you who Lesha Ukrainka is. She is the most intellectual writer in Ukrainian literature. She is brilliant. She just writes bad lyric poetry. What her strength is drama. She writes poetic dramas, and this is her career is famous for the dramas, that is, and they are some of the most erudite, some of the most sophisticated intellectual texts you'll ever see. That is, her text, she wrote on various subjects. The two plays I most commonly teach in my classes, one is about Don Juan, that is the stone host, and she turns this into a fantastic feminist argument between Donna Anna and the princess, right? And the other one is Cassandra, the story of coming back and killing the husband who has betrayed her, right? In any case, in this particular well-known poem, Contra spem spero, she's doing what I keep saying is the heart and soul of Ukrainian poetry. That is, sorrow and joy with an emphasis on sorrow. That is, you can't have unadulterated joy ever, right? And the sentiment, I mean, you can see the meme where we put this in her mouth, right? It's a checklist of things that I got to do today, straight out of Franklin. She is notorious in Ukrainian literature, in the study of Ukrainian literature, as being represented this way. That is, this woman who is struggling and struggling and struggling, and will make it somehow, and against all hope, things are bleak, things are terrible, but we're going to make it somehow, right? We'll fight for it. As you can see, it doesn't speak to me. Right? I find this to be terribly repetitive and not very sophisticated. The imagery of the poem is soapbox. It's all declarative. It's all this person saying, I will fight for whatever it is I'm fighting for. I will never rest, right? I will go on, right? One of the reasons why Ukrainians admire this has nothing to do with the poetry. It has to do with the person. Lesya Ukrainka was diagnosed with tuberculosis at age 12 and led a life of extraordinary pain. That is, she traveled a great deal. She traveled to Berlin to get operated. It didn't work. The doctors told her, go to places with a warm, dry climate. So she did a lot of that. If you read it that way, you see why so many Ukrainians just admire Lesya Ukrainka's enormous bravery. But the text itself leaves something to be desired. The next Lesya poem is also curious. You can see Lesya Ukrainka makes it, the 200 hryvnia note in Ukraine is Lesya Ukrainka, right? This poem, A Bright Little Moon, Mi-shach moon, is the mi from Do Re Mi. That is, she wrote a sequence of poems, Do Re Mi Fa Sol La Ti Do. And all of them begin with that sound, right? And this is the mi poem. And what can I say about it? It's a lullaby that is, clearly a simplistic text for children. Although even this has elements that, let's scare the hell out of the poor child, right? That is, you keep sleeping because the moment you wake up, all hell is going to break loose. But it is what it is. This is another, weak poem by Lesya. That is, she wrote dramas from about 1896-7 onward. The lyric poetry is all earlier. Right? She's a very young woman. That is, the Contra Spero poem, she's 19. Right? And already, against all hope, oh me, oh my. Right? And that immaturity wears off. Once we get to her dramas, this woman thinks faster and better than anybody else you've ever met, right? But not in these poems. Here, another kind of simplistic sentiment straight out of Heine, that is, I want to be a song. That is, nothing in the world is better than to become a song, right? Finally, on another note in Lesya's career, she spent a lot of time in Crimea, and she has a whole cycle of Orientalist poems. This particular poem may well be tied to one of two individuals. I've got their names on the screen. That is, Lesya Ukrainka fell in love with another tuberculosis sufferer that she met in Crimea during this stay. But by this point, he had left, and she had gotten news from her mother about a friend of the family who had gotten married, but the marriage went very bad. And I suspect this is a poem that is tied to that person more than anything else. But it's a symptom that is, Lesya Ukrainka will spend a good deal of time in Egypt because of her tuberculosis, and she has a whole sequence of poems of an Orientalist character. Let me just say a few words about Oleś. Oleś is, his real name is Kandyba. He was a veterinarian, as you can see. That is, he was one of the poets who was trying to move away from folklore. That is, Kandyba, more than some of the earlier poets, had started writing in a way in the direction of Tyczyna. Tyczyna, in fact, started writing after reading Oleś's poetry. That is, he saw the power of sound in words. But Oleś, in terms of his sentiments, that is, he's a good poet in terms of sound organization. He sticks to the idea, well, his most famous collection of poems is called Joy and Sorrow Have Embraced. And I've been beating that horse a little too long, so maybe I'll just leave it at that.